Sir Graham, I'm conscious that everyone needs to get in, so I'm going to try and be as brief as possible. Most of these things have obviously probably already been said and certainly will be said in the course of the debate, so I make no claim on uniqueness on this. I rise to support the government's bill, Internal Markets Bill, particularly today with reference to clauses 40 to 45. After all, the goods and trades of free flow in the UK is critical. It's part of the constitutional settlement, both the settlement between Ireland and later Northern Ireland and GB, and Scotland, of course, earlier, and England. And so these are right at the core of what we believe, what we consider to be immutable, and therefore cannot be changed. And there are areas of this which, in this agreement, in the protocol, which, if improperly used, can, of course, affect that, and that cannot be allowed. So I remind colleagues, too, in the House that in the bill, nobody seems to have referenced it, it was very clear what our potential intentions were in Clause 38, which was, in fact, part of the bill when it was passed. And, as I recall, the opposition didn't vote against that. And if that was the case, then that sent a very strong signal to the EU that there was every likelihood that we considered that constitutional settlement in the UK was above the implementation of this should it end up damaging it. And that was quite clear. In fact, it was so clear that when we'd have passed both houses, what was interesting was the EU still went ahead and ratified their end of it through the European Parliament, knowing full well that was in the bill. So if they disagreed with that or disagreed with the principle, they should not, of course, ratify the treaty at their end, but they made no bones about it, they did. So the effect of these clauses, I think, actually just protect the basic implementation of the UK's internal market in terms of its constitution, and they allow state aids in Great Britain, and I recognise the concerns of my colleagues in Northern Ireland about the application of those as well in Northern Ireland, but in this case, Great Britain to be spent under the framework devised in this country and not elsewhere. It seems intolerable to me that you leave the EU only to find that they have hold of you in a number of ways, which my right honourable friend Jimmy Barnett said quite categorically was never the intention. And I don't also believe that this does actually break international treaties, particularly not at this stage. I think Article 46 in the Law of Treaties is quite clear about that, and that these things are always open to interpretation. I accept that, and different lawyers will take different views on that. But generally, I think that at this stage, particularly, it does not. And I think my honourable friend who spoke earlier on from Bromley was clear that's one of the reasons why he is prepared to go along and accommodate the government on this, and I think that is quite reasonable. And the combined effect of Article 4 of the Withdrawal Agreement, Section 7A of the UK Act, means that key parts of the withdrawal agreement and the NIP are already part of domestic law. And that's what makes it impossible, therefore, for the government, should they see that the EU is not acting in good faith at this particular point, to ensure there is, in a sense, a backstop to this. Now, I raised a point with the right honourable lady's colleague earlier on about the EU's behaviour in this. And it wasn't as a kind of, look, the EU doesn't recognise always international law as applied internally. It was, and therefore we should. That wasn't the point. The point I was making was, we talk a lot about trust, and there's a lot of a debate here about trust. The UK will lose all trust should it do this. No one will ever trust us again. I don't believe a word of that, by the way, because so many other countries, including the UK, have previously breached international law for lots of good reasons. But the EU binds it in that it is their right to breach international law, and this was very clear, as I made earlier on with Caddy versus Council Commission in 2008. The Advocate General made it very clear that they don't necessarily have to bind in to, with direct effect, international treaties if they clash with their constitutional settlement. And they make that time again, which has given us a very long list of occasions when the EU has done just that. They have refused to implement all or in part of international treaties. Now, I don't extol their virtues in this. I simply regard that as a reality. Now, what does that say? Does the rest of the world say the EU cannot be trusted in international agreements? So far, apparently not. So far, they've done deals with a number of different countries, and not one of them has said, we don't trust you because you breach international law, which they do. But the UK has also breached international law. In fact, it was a Labour government that refused to implement, as I recall, about 2005, the prisoners' voting rights, which came directly from the Human Rights Commission. And all that happened was they said no. And it took 10 years before this was resolved. And it wasn't resolved because a government, a UK, at that stage, I think, Conservative government, later on, my right honourable friend was Prime Minister, who implemented it. No. What they did was negotiate it again over the implementation and what the observance of it was, and came up with a fudge. Now, that's the point about international law. It isn't always directly applicable and by the letter. Ultimately, when things aren't agreed to be brought in, then they require negotiation subsequently. And that's what I say my right honourable friends are absolutely right in doing, in using these clauses to make it very clear to the European Union, should they wish to pursue a line that literally does not agree to work hard in the Joint Committee to resolve these matters, which are always a problem about application, then the UK still reserves its right not to breach its own constitutional settlement, which is a primary cause of most of those breaches of international law amongst the whole world. I see my honourable friend give it away. Yeah.
I'm grateful. I intervened because the prisoner voting issue was one I remember very well as the then minister responsible for this issue of policy. And indeed, our friend David Cameron, who was then the Prime Minister, made it clear in his interview last week that he wasn't as firm as some of the former Prime Ministers because he recognised there were these clashes. His point was that you shouldn't break your commitments as a first course, but having them as a backstop with parliamentary control was actually something that was worth considering. And I think the example my right honourable friend gave is a very sound one.
That's why I gave way to him, because he was there, and I think he was a very good minister too, by the way, for what it's worth. But I just want to say that the point here was, for 10 years, Labour governments and other governments simply refused to put this through. And finally, there was a fudge negotiation where not all of what they asked for was agreed, but they agreed in action that it was okay what had been done with regards to, I think, on furlough. Prisoners on furlough, as I recall, had voting rights. That wasn't what they asked for. So let's not be too pompous about this idea that somehow international law is like some God-given gospel that says absolutely nobody can ever trespass away from this, because many of these things are fudged anyway. And the implementation of that is very important. I come back to 38, clause 38, which he's not here, my honourable friend Stone actually was the initiator of. It made it very clear that we would, if necessary, place our constitutional law ahead of both of those. And I make this point really because, in truth, where we are now is in exactly that state. That's why I believe tonight I can happily vote for this. I'm happy, by the way, that my honourable friend from Bromley and his debate with the government and their acceptance of this in 66, I think it is, and others will actually give the Parliament a chance to say yea or nay when that moment comes. But we are not anyway in breach until we decide to absolutely implement that. And this has been done before, and I think, therefore, this is very important. If we show that we want to do this, if necessary, but we'd rather find an agreement between the parties, I think that's very, very good and important. I come back to that good faith in principle point, which I made earlier on. You know, it's quite interesting. I see that Monsieur Barnier has threatened our negotiators that if they don't agree with him, and he hasn't, by the way, wanted to move anywhere near the Joint Committee to discuss these matters, that they would, if necessary, not have us with the status of a third country. Now, it seems to me a bizarre kind of threat to make, and the list of these countries, which my right honourable friend also mentioned, is long and peculiar. Belarus, for example, which we all watch almost nightly on the television, well, that would have third country status. We wouldn't have it, apparently. Central African Republic, China, Iran, Islamic Republic of Iran. I mean, the list goes on and on. I think there are now 137 countries who would have third country status, but apparently, Mr. Barnier, it would be quite acceptable for a country that has been very close to the EU for years, would not have third country status. I think it's a hollow threat, by the way, but it is a peculiar threat to make, and gives you an indication, and this is the point I want to make, of bad faith. Now, bad faith in this is part of what the EU is meant to avoid, and so are we. And so the whole idea of this is to say, stop, let's consider this again. We do not want, and you should not want, to end up having us just running around on your laws. This is not part of what the agreement was meant to be, and therefore we are not prepared to see our constitutional settlement trashed in the pursuit of your own vainglorious idea that somehow you're going to keep hold of us and run us afterwards. As my honourable friend said, we didn't vote to be a subsidiary state. We voted for independence. And that is the key point, and I close by simply saying to the House that I am going to vote for this tonight. I vote for it with a clean heart. I vote for it because so much of what we do, from state aids through to transfer of goods and agri-products, will be affected, labelling, all these areas unnecessarily. If the EU seriously wants to help and to get this done, then they need to return to the table, do the joint committee as they said, and accept what we're saying. We will not allow our constitution to become the prisoner of an EU that wants to have all power over the UK.
Yeah.
Sir Graham, I rise to speak in favour of the amendments 43 and 44 tabled in my name, and also to give my support to the amendments tabled in the name of the Scottish National Party and our friends from the SDLP and our friend from the Alliance Party. Sir Graham, I'm going to focus my comments mainly on my amendments, which are laid to try and work out just how far this government are prepared to go in ousting the jurisdiction of the domestic courts in relation to